The wind, a razor sharpened on the peaks of the Black Hills, screamed a death song around Jedediah Stone's cabin. Inside the fire spat defiance, but offered little comfort against the memory of the blizzard's white fury. He'd found the old Lakota man, then a frozen husk clinging to life's last ember. An act of grudging mercy, a debt repaid to a universe that had taken too much. Weeks later, the snows had retreated, but the silence of the wilderness was broken by a different kind of offering. An ancient carved totem left upon his doorstep. A gift, a warning Jedediah would soon learn that some debts are never fully paid, and some symbols carry the weight of destinies. The winter of '77 had descended upon the Dakota territory with a vindictive snarl. For Jedediah Stone, a man who wore solitude like a second skin, it was just another season to endure in his isolated cabin, nestled deep in a fold of the formidable Black Hills. The gold rush frenzy that had gripped Deadwood and the surrounding areas felt a world away, though its tendrils of greed and violence often slithered even into these remote parts. Jed preferred the company of his traps, the murmur of the pines, and the ghosts of his past, painful companions, but familiar ones. He was a man carved from the unforgiving landscape itself, tall and lean, with eyes the gray of a winter sky and a face etched with lines that spoke of hardship and loss. His wife Sarah and young son Tom lay buried back east, victims of a fever that had swept through their small settlement years ago, a tragedy that had driven him west, seeking not fortune, but oblivion. The blizzard struck, without preamble, a swirling white maelstrom that blotted out the sun and turned the world into an indistinguishable hell of ice and wind. For 3 days it raged. Jedediah, rationing his firewood and provisions, listened to the timbers of his cabin groan under the assault. On the 4th morning, the wind had quieted to a mournful keen, the snow lying in colossal sculpted drifts. Duty, the relentless master of a solitary life, called him to check his trap lines. It was near the frozen creek, where the skeletal arms of cottonwoods clawed at the sky, that he found him. At first, Jedediah thought it was a snow-drifted log or a dead animal. Then he saw the faint wisp of breath, a fleeting vapor against the icy air, and the edge of a beaded moccasin. Brushing away the snow, he uncovered the still form of an old Lakota man, his face like a weathered map of suffering, his deerskin clothing stiff with frost. He was perilously close to death. A knot tightened in Jedediah's gut. The Lakota. Stories of brutal raids of settlers slaughtered were common currency in the territory, fueling a hatred that burned as fiercely as any prairie fire. His own Sarah had harbored a deep fear of the native tribes, a fear amplified by the tales told by passing traders and frightened homesteaders. Helping this man could bring trouble, accusations, perhaps even violence, down upon his own head. The settlers were jumpy, and the army even more so. He could leave him, walk away. The blizzard had claimed many, and this one would just be another forgotten soul. It would be the sensible thing, the safe thing. But then he saw the man's hand, gnarled and blue with cold, clutched around a small, worn leather pouch. It reminded him, inexplicably, of his own father's hands, calloused from years of farming hands that had once held his own with rough tenderness. And he remembered Sarah's words from a time before the fear took root. Kindness costs nothing, Jedediah, but its worth is immeasurable. Cursing his own sentimentality, Jedediah made his decision. With a grunt of effort, he hoisted the surprisingly light elder onto his shoulders. The journey back to the cabin was a brutal struggle against the deep snow and the burning in his lungs. Each step was a battle, the old man, a leaden weight, his shallow breaths, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life. Inside, he laid the Lakota near the hearth, stripping away the frozen garments with a practical, if not gentle, efficiency. The man's skin was like ice. Jedediah rubbed his limbs, trying to restore circulation, forcing lukewarm broth, laced with a little whiskey between his cracked lips. For hours, he worked, driven by a stubborn refusal to let death claim another soul on his watch. Days bled into one another. The elder, whose name Jedediah didn't know and wouldn't have been able to pronounce, slowly, painstakingly clawed his way back from the brink. He remained mostly silent, his dark eyes ancient and knowing, following Jedediah's movements. There was no gratitude spoken, nor was any expected. An understanding profound and elemental passed between them, in the shared warmth of the small cabin, in the ritual of sustenance and care. Jedediah would occasionally find the old man's gaze on him, unreadable, deep as a forest pool. He spoke a few words in his native tongue, guttural sounds that meant nothing to Jed, but the tone seemed observational, perhaps even assessing. Jedediah learned the Lakota's name was Wakan, or at least that's what it sounded like when the old man finally spoke a word Jed recognized from pidgin phrases used by traders. Wakan, he'd rasped, touching his own chest, his eyes holding Jed's, holy, sacred. Then one morning, a week after the blizzard had broken, Jedediah awoke to find Wakan gone. The worn blanket Jed had given him was neatly folded. Beside it on the rough-hewn table lay 3 freshly caught trout, their silver scales still gleaming. No words, no farewell, just the fish and an empty space by the fire. Jedediah carried the trout to the creek to clean them. The silence of the cabin felt different now, not empty, but resonant with an unspoken exchange. He had saved a life, a Lakota life. He didn't know if he'd done a good thing or a foolish one. He only knew he'd done it. As he looked out over the snow-clad expanse of the Black Hills, a sense of unease settled over him, as cold and deep as the winter earth. The wilderness kept its secrets, and sometimes it offered them up in the most unexpected ways. The thaw arrived weeks later, a slow, muddy affair that turned the trails into quagmires and the creeks into roaring torrents. With the reopening of the passes, Jedediah Stone made his way to the burgeoning ramshackle settlement of Redemption Gulch, a collection of tents, hastily erected wooden storefronts, and saloons that clung to the edge of the mining claims like a persistent fungus. It wasn't as notorious as Deadwood, but it possessed its own share of desperation and lawlessness. He needed supplies, flour salt ammunition, and perhaps a bottle of whiskey to ward off the lingering chill and the ghosts that the silence of his cabin sometimes amplified. News like mud stuck to a man in Redemption Gulch. As Jed bartered his winter pelts, beaver mink and a few prime fox, with Silas Blackwood's trading post, he felt the familiar weight of curious eyes. Blackwood, a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes, ran the most prosperous enterprise in the Gulch. He owned the trading post, the saloon, and held the mortgage on half the mining claims in the area. His influence was a quiet, creeping vine, wrapping itself around the settlement's heart. He was stout, always dressed in a slightly too fine waistcoat. For such a rough place, his fingers often adorned with garish rings, drumming impatiently on the counter. Stone, Blackwood greeted his voice smooth as oiled leather. Good to see you survived the White Death. Some weren't so lucky. He gestured vaguely towards the snow-capped peaks. Heard tell You had a visitor out your way? An Injun, wasn't it? Jedediah kept his face impassive, counting the coins Blackwood laid out. The blizzard brought all sorts of creatures to my door, Blackwood, most of them four-legged. Blackwood chuckled a dry, rasping sound. This one was two-legged, I hear. Lakota. Old fellow, word travels stone, even in these quiet hills. He leaned forward, his voice dropping conspiratorially. Some might say that's a dangerous kind of charity. These are tense times. The army's itching for any excuse, and men around here, well, they ain't too fond of any man who'd offer comfort to a redskin. Around them, the low hum of conversation in the trading post seemed to dip. A few hard-faced miners nursing grievances and cheap whiskey cast furtive glances Jedediah's way. Jed felt a familiar prickle of anger, the same defensiveness that had isolated him for years. I offer comfort to any man freezing to death, Blackwood. Didn't ask his creed or his color. Jedediah met his gaze squarely. A man's humanity ain't measured by the company he keeps in a blizzard. Perhaps, Blackwood conceded, though his eyes glinted with something akin to amusement. But alliances are, and in these parts, alliances mean survival. Or otherwise. He pushed a small complimentary tin of tobacco across the counter. Just friendly advice, Stone. The Black Hills are a treasure chest, and some treasures are best left undisturbed. Others, he paused, tapping the pouch where Jedediah carried his earnings, are meant to be claimed by those bold enough to take them. Jedediah pocketed his money and the tobacco, giving a curt nod. I'll keep that in mind. As he left the trading post, the whispers followed him like flies, buzzing over something dead. Injun lover. One grimy prospector muttered into his drink at the saloon next door, loud enough for Jedediah to hear. Another spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near his boots as he passed. Jedediah ignored them, his jaw tight. He knew this tune. It was the same discord that had played out across the frontier for generations. Fear breeding hatred, hatred breeding violence. His past, the one he'd tried to bury in the vastness of the West, echoed in those whispers. Sarah had been terrified of Indian raids, her fear fed by exaggerated tales and the genuine anxieties of frontier life. After she and Tom had died, not at the hands of any tribe, but by the silent, indiscriminate killer that was disease, Jedediah had found himself adrift in a sea of grief and bitterness. For a time, he'd shared the common animosity, seeing every Native American as a threat. But years of solitude, of watching the land, of understanding the harsh balance of survival had eroded some of that inherited prejudice. He'd seen white men commit atrocities that would make any Lakota warrior blanch. He'd come to understand that good and evil wore many faces, many colors. The encounter with Wakan had stirred something dormant within him. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but a thread of connection, a recognition of shared existence in a brutal world. Now that single act of mercy was painting a target on his back. Later that day, as he was loading his meager supplies onto his pack mule, two of Blackwood's hired guns approached him. They were typical frontier toughs, lean and dangerous, with Colt revolvers strapped low on their hips. One, a hulking brute named Pike, had a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, giving him a perpetual sneer. The other, smaller and wirier, was called Reno, his eyes shifty and cruel. Stone, Pike grunted, blocking his path. Mr. Blackwood, he's a generous man. He don't like to see folks make mistakes. That a fact? Jedediah said, his hand resting near the butt of his own holstered pistol. Reno chimed in, his voice a high-pitched whine. Yeah, fact. And consorting with hostiles, that's a big mistake round here. Folks get unlucky. I told Blackwood my position. Jedediah stated, his voice low and steady. I'm not looking for trouble. Trouble has a way of finding men like you, Pike retorted, stepping closer, trying to intimidate. Maybe that old Injun left you something, a trinket. Sometimes they carry charms, things they reckon are valuable. Jedediah's mind flashed to the 3 trout. He left me with his thanks in his own way. That's all. Pike's eyes narrowed. You best be sure about that. Mr. Blackwood, he's got an interest in local artifacts, historical things. Then he can go dig for them himself, Jedediah said, pushing past Pike. The big man tensed, but Jedediah kept walking, the weight of their gazes on his back. He knew this wasn't the end of it. Blackwood wasn't a man to be easily dissuaded, especially if he smelled profit or an opportunity to assert his dominance. The ride back to his cabin was somber. The beauty of the Black Hills, with their pine-clad slopes and granite outcrops, seemed tainted by the ugliness he'd encountered in Redemption Gulch. The isolation that had once been a balm now felt more precarious, his small cabin a vulnerable outpost in a world where suspicion was a currency and violence a common language. He wondered about Wakan, about the silent bond they had formed. Had the old man understood the risk Jedediah had taken, or was it simply an exchange, a life for a life with no further meaning? He was about to find out that some exchanges had repercussions far beyond what he could have ever imagined. The wilderness was stirring, and it wasn't just the spring thaw. Weeks slipped by, marked by the lengthening days and the vibrant green blush that spread across the hills. Jedediah fell back into his familiar rhythm, checking his traps, hunting for game, reinforcing his cabin against the coming seasons. The unease from Redemption Gulch lingered, a subtle tension in the air, but no further trouble had materialized. He almost allowed himself to believe Blackwood and his cronies had forgotten about him, dismissed him as an inconsequential recluse. Then came the morning of the Totem. He'd risen before dawn, the air crisp, and carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. As he unlatched his cabin door to greet the pale light, he saw it. Propped against the rough-hewn logs of his doorframe was an object unlike anything he had ever seen up close. It was a totem, perhaps 2 feet in height, carved from a single piece of dark weathered wood, possibly cedar or cottonwood root. The craftsmanship was intricate, deeply grooved, and imbued with a raw, primitive power. At its apex was a fearsome, stylized eagle, its wings partly spread as if about to take flight or swoop upon prey, its eyes inlaid with polished stones that seemed to glitter even in the dim pre-dawn light. Below the eagle, other figures were carved: a snarling wolf, a stolid bison, and geometric patterns that spiraled and interlocked with mesmerizing complexity. The wood was smooth in places, clearly from much handling, yet the carvings retained their sharp definition. It bore no dust from the trail. It had been placed there recently, deliberately. Jedediah stared at it, a cold knot forming in his stomach. There was no mistaking its origin. This was Lakota, and it was not just any carving. It radiated a sense of age, of sacredness. He touched it tentatively. The wood was cool, almost alive beneath his calloused fingertips. His first thought was Wakan. This had to be from him or his people. But why? Was it a gift, a thank you more profound than the 3 trout? Or was it something else entirely? A marker, a claim, a warning? The silence of the wilderness offered no answers, only the whisper of the wind through the pines, which now seemed to carry an unfamiliar, watchful quality. He brought the totem inside, placing it on his small table. It dominated the humble cabin, an alien presence that was both beautiful and unsettling. Throughout the day, His eyes kept drifting to it. The eagle seemed to watch him, its stone eyes imbued with an ancient wisdom he couldn't fathom. He felt a strange pull towards it, a sense of responsibility that he couldn't explain. News of such an unusual object, even in the isolated corners of the Black Hills, had a way of seeping out. Perhaps a passing trapper, scouting new territory, had seen him with it. Perhaps one of Blackwood's far-ranging prospectors had spied it from a ridge. However it happened, it wasn't long before Silas Blackwood heard about the totem. The change in atmosphere was palpable the next time Jedediah was forced to visit Redemption Gulch for supplies. The stares were more intense, the whispers more pointed. Blackwood himself sought Jedediah out, his usual veneer of predatory affability stretched thin. "Stone," he said, his voice tight with an almost feverish curiosity. "I hear you've come into possession of a rather unique piece of native art." He didn't bother with pleasantries. "A totem, they say. An old one." "It was a gift," Jedediah replied curtly, already regretting the necessity of this trip. "A gift." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "From your Lakota friend, I presume?" "Such generosity. These artifacts, stone, can be immensely valuable, not just in monetary terms, but historically, culturally." His gaze was rapacious. "Some say these totems mark sacred places, burial grounds, perhaps even hidden gold." The last two words hung in the air, a lure for the greedy souls that populated the gulch. Jedediah saw the flicker of interest in the eyes of the men lingering nearby. "It's not for sale, Blackwood, and it doesn't mark any gold. Everything has a price, stone," Blackwood purred, "or a consequence for holding onto it too tightly. That totem, it's a powerful symbol. To some, it might look like you're siding with them, that you're privy to their secrets, secrets that others might want to uncover." The threat was no longer veiled. Jedediah knew Blackwood coveted the totem not for its cultural significance, but for whatever material gain or leverage it might represent. Blackwood was a man who believed the Lakota, and indeed the land itself, were obstacles to his ambition, resources to be exploited or eradicated. Returning to his cabin, Jedediah felt a new kind of isolation. The totem sitting silently in the dim light was no longer just a mysterious gift. It was a fulcrum, a point around which dangerous forces were beginning to converge. He began to experience unsettling occurrences. A trapline, meticulously set, would be sprung, the bait gone, but no animal caught. Strange clicking sounds, like pebbles being knocked together, would echo from the woods at night. Once he found a single eagle feather placed carefully on his windowsill, identical to the type of feathers that adorned Lakota ceremonial dress. Was it Wakan's people watching him, testing him? Or was it Blackwood's men trying to spook him, to make him believe the totem was cursed, or attracting unwanted attention from its original owners? Paranoia, a seed planted by Blackwood's insinuations and nurtured by these strange events, began to take root. He slept lighter, his rifle always within reach. The totem, with its unblinking stone eyes, seemed to be at the center of it all, a silent harbinger of a storm he could feel gathering on the horizon. He was a solitary man, caught in a drama not of his own making, bound by an act of kindness and an ancient piece of wood. The price of that kindness, it seemed, was yet to be fully tallied. The disquiet around Jedediah's cabin grew no longer subtle, but a palpable presence. The feeling of being watched was constant. The strange occurrences intensified. A carefully stacked woodpile would be partially dismantled, overnight tools sometimes moved from their usual spots. It was unnerving, designed to fray his nerves. He suspected Blackwood's men were behind the more disruptive acts, trying to drive him to paranoia or force him to abandon the totem. But the eagle feather, the almost respectful distance of the night sounds, those felt different, less malicious, more observant. He knew he couldn't keep the totem indefinitely, not with Blackwood sniffing around like a starved wolf. It was too dangerous for him and potentially for Wakan's people if it fell into the wrong hands. He needed to understand what it truly signified. Was it a mere thank you, or did its presence bind him to something larger, something he was failing to comprehend? His mind turned to Nita. She lived on the fringes of Redemption Gulch, in a small, neat cabin by the Willow Creek, a good distance from the town's squalor and judgment. Nita was a woman of mixed heritage. Her father, a French trapper, her mother, a Brûlée Lakota. She navigated the precarious space between two worlds, respected by some for her knowledge of herbs and languages, distrusted by others for her native blood. She traded in remedies, information, and sometimes discretion. Jedediah had dealt with her a few times for poultices and hard-to-find supplies. She was quiet, observant, and possessed a wisdom that belied her relatively young age, perhaps 30 winters, though her eyes held the weariness of many more. He rode to her cabin, the totem carefully wrapped in a worn blanket and secured to his saddle. Nita greeted him with her usual calm, her dark, intelligent eyes taking in the bundle before he even spoke. "Jedediah Stone," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It is not often you seek company." She gestured him indeed. Her cabin was simple, but orderly, filled with the scent of drying herbs and wood smoke. He unwrapped the totem, placing it on her small table. Nita drew a sharp breath, her composure momentarily broken. She circled it slowly, her fingers hovering over the carvings but not touching them. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice hushed with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Jedediah recounted the story of Wakan and the blizzard and the totem's mysterious appearance. Nita listened intently, her gaze fixed on the carved figures. "This is no mere trinket, Jedediah," she said finally, her brow furrowed. "This is a Wanyan Waptuha, a sacred ancestral carving. It speaks of lineage, of history, of spiritual protection. The eagle Wang Bli is a messenger to Wakan Thanka, the great mystery. The wolf Shun Jumanitu Thanka represents guidance and loyalty, but also the ferocity of the hunter. The bison that Thankaka is life sustenance, the sacred provider." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "To be given such a thing, Wakan must hold you in very high esteem, or he has placed a great burden upon you. Such items are deeply significant to the Oyat, the people. They are not lightly given, nor carelessly displayed." "Blackwood knows I have it," Jedediah said grimly. "He wants it, thinks it leads to gold or some such." Nita's lips thinned. "Silas Blackwood. He is a man who sees value only in what he can exploit or destroy. If he covets this, he will not stop. This totem could be used by him to cause great mischief, perhaps even to desecrate a sacred site to provoke your government's soldiers. He profits from conflict." "What should I do with it?" Jedediah asked. "I can't keep it. It feels like holding a lightning rod in a thunderstorm." "It is a protector," Nita said, gently touching the eagle's head. "It is said such totems carry the spirit of those they represent. It may well be protecting you already. The strange things you've noticed, some might be Wakan's kin, ensuring the totem and you are safe. They would be watching. But Blackwood's men are clumsy and cruel. Their disturbances would feel different." Jedediah considered this. It made a strange kind of sense. The feeling of being watched hadn't always been malevolent. It needs to be returned to Wakan's people, Nita continued, or at least its message understood by them. Its presence with you, an outsider, could be misinterpreted by others in his tribe, even if Wakan himself intended it as a mark of respect. It could draw the wrong kind of attention, not just from men like Blackwood, but from those who do not understand Wakan's reasons. Before they could discuss it further, the crack of a rifle shattered the afternoon quiet. A bullet slammed into the doorframe of Nita's cabin, splinters exploding inwards. "Get down!" Jedediah yelled, shoving Nita towards the floor and drawing his Colt. He peered through a small window. 3 men on horseback were positioned among the trees on the far side of the creek, Pike Reno and another of Blackwood's thugs. "Stone," Pike bellowed, "we know you're in there, and we know you got the Injun witch with you. Send out the totem, and we'll let you both walk away." "They were waiting for me," Jedediah muttered, fury coiling in his chest. Blackwood must have had him followed. "They will not let us walk away, Jedediah," Nita said calmly from the floor, her face pale but resolute. "Not while we know what this totem means, and not while I live to translate it." "Stay down," Jedediah ordered. He fired a shot over their heads, sending them ducking behind the trees. "We're not giving you anything." The fight was short, but brutal. Pike and his men laid down covering fire, trying to pin them inside the cabin. Jedediah, a practiced shot from years of hunting and solitary defense, returned fire sparingly, making each bullet count. Nita surprisingly produced an old but well-maintained Spencer carbine from beneath her cot. "My father taught me to shoot," she said grimly, taking up a position by another window. "He said a woman alone needs to be more dangerous than any man." One of Blackwood's men, trying to get a better angle, exposed himself for a moment too long. Jedediah's shot caught him in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse with a cry of pain. Reno, seeing his companion fall, seemed to lose his nerve and began to fire wildly. Pike, enraged, urged his horse forward, firing rapidly at the cabin. "You'll pay for that, Stone." Jedediah felt a searing pain in his left arm as a bullet grazed him. He gritted his teeth, aimed carefully, and squeezed the trigger. Pike's horse screamed and reared as the bullet struck its flank, throwing the big man heavily to the ground. Pike lay stunned for a moment, then scrambled for cover, his face contorted with rage. Seeing their leader down and one of their own wounded, Reno and the injured man decided they'd had enough. Reno helped his companion onto his horse, and they retreated hastily into the woods, leaving Pike behind. Pike, now alone and on foot, cursed them. He fired one last, desperate shot before turning and disappearing into the trees, clearly in no condition to continue the fight alone against 2 armed defenders. The silence that descended was heavy, broken only by the chirping of oblivious birds and the frantic whimpering of Pike's injured horse. Jedediah sagged against the wall, his arm throbbing. Nita was already tearing strips from a clean cloth. "You're hit," she said, her voice betraying a tremor of concern. "Just a graze," Jedediah grunted, though it burned like fire. As Nita expertly cleaned and bandaged his wound, her touch surprisingly gentle, she looked at the totem, then at Jedediah. "This has changed things," she said softly. "Blackwood will be furious. He will not let this go. That totem is now a symbol of defiance." Jedediah looked at the intricately carved wood. The eagle's stone eyes seemed to hold a new light, a fiercer gleam. Nita was right. The first blood had been spilled over it. What began as an act of mercy, then a mysterious gift, had now escalated into open conflict. The path ahead was no longer his to choose alone. The totem and the forces it represented were drawing him deeper into a struggle he was only beginning to understand. He had to protect it, not just from Blackwood, but for whatever purpose Wakan had intended. And he had a sinking feeling that Nita, whether she wanted to or not, was now tied to its fate as well. Silas Blackwood was not a man accustomed to setbacks. When Pike stumbled back to Redemption Gulch, bruised, alone, and without the totem, Blackwood's fury was a cold, venomous thing. He didn't rage or shout. His anger was more insidious, a tightening of the eyes, a chilling quietness that made his men more fearful than any outburst. Pike, nursing his injuries and his pride, reported Stone's unexpected resistance and the involvement of that half-breed woman Nita. The fact that Stone had fought back and that Nita, the quiet herb woman, had aided him was an affront. But more than that, the totem itself had taken on an almost obsessive importance in Blackwood's mind. He was convinced it was more than just a piece of carved wood. His sources, a network of informants and gossips, had hinted at old Lakota legends of sacred objects that marked hidden valleys, ancestral burial sites filled with offerings, or even caches of gold spirited away when the tribes were forced onto reservations. The Black Hills were, after all, sacred to the Lakota, Pahasapa, the heart of everything that is. What better place to hide something of immense value? He saw the totem as a key, and Jedediah Stone, now aided by Nita, was standing in his way. His initial plan to simply intimidate Stone into surrendering the artifact had failed. Escalation was now necessary. Blackwood summoned his core group of enforcers, men harder and more ruthless than Pike and Reno, who were little more than glorified bullies. This inner circle included a dour, scar-faced ex-Confederate sharpshooter named Cully and a pair of brutal, opportunistic brothers, Abe and Zeke, known for their lack of scruples and their enjoyment of violence. Stone is proving more troublesome than anticipated, Blackwood stated, his voice deceptively mild as he addressed them in the back room of his saloon, the air thick with stale beer and cigar smoke. And the woman Nita, she knows too much about native ways. She might even be able to decipher the totem's true meaning if she hasn't already. He paused, letting his words sink in. This totem is important, not just for its intrinsic value, but for what it represents: control. If we can secure it and perhaps discover what it guards, it will be a significant blow to the Lakota's morale, a symbol of our dominance in these hills. He conveniently omitted his more avaricious motives. "What's the plan, boss?" Cully asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "A more direct approach is needed," Blackwood said, "but not a direct assault on Stone's cabin, not yet. That could bring unwanted attention from Fort Meade if soldiers happen to be patrolling. No, we need to be smarter. We need to make Stone and the woman want to bring the totem out into the open, or better yet, lead us to where it truly belongs." His eyes gleamed. "I have it on good authority that there's a significant Lakota summer encampment forming near Bear Butte." Bear Butte, or Matopaha, was a site of immense spiritual significance to the Lakota and Cheyenne, a place of vision quests and ceremonies. It's likely this Wakan fellow, the one Stone rescued, is from that band. The totem will be important to them. Perhaps it's a ceremonial piece needed for this gathering. Blackwood outlined his scheme. He wouldn't try to steal the totem from Stone directly, not immediately. Instead, he would create a situation so perilous that Stone and Nita would feel compelled to seek out Awakens people likely to return the totem or warn them. His men would then track them. The beauty of this plan, in Blackwood's eyes, was that Stone and Nita would lead him straight to the Lakota and potentially to the sacred site or hidden cache the totem might signify. "We will also spread rumors," Blackwood continued, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. Whispers that Stone and the woman are not just friendly with the Lakota, but are actively working with them, perhaps even planning to raid isolated claims. We'll suggest the totem is a signal, a call to arms. Let fear do some of our work for us. It will isolate Stone further and make anyone hesitant to help him. He also had another darker contingency. If the opportunity arose, he would try to steal the totem and use it to desecrate a Lakota sacred site himself, then plant evidence to frame a rival mining outfit or even renegade elements within the Lakota, thus inciting chaos that he could exploit. He was a master at playing both ends against the middle. Meanwhile, at Nita's cabin, the aftermath of the gunfight had left a grim determination. Jedediah's arm was stiff and sore, a constant reminder of the escalating stakes. Nita, usually so serene, was visibly shaken, but also hardened by the attack. "They will not stop, Jedediah," she reiterated, her gaze distant, as she stared out at the trees where their attackers had hidden. Blackwood is like a sickness. He infects everything he touches with greed and violence. The totem is now a symbol of defiance, and he cannot abide that. She had contacts, a few trusted Lakota, who sometimes came to her for trade or news from the white man's world. Through a carefully worded message sent with a young Lakota boy, who occasionally hunted nearby Nita, began to gather information. It was slow, dangerous work. Days later, the boy returned, his face etched with worry. He brought news that confirmed Nita's fears and Blackwood's machinations. Whispers were indeed spreading through the mining camps and even reaching some of the more isolated Lakota bands. Stories of a white man and a mixed-blood woman holding a sacred object, some said hostage, others said as a sign of a dark alliance. Worse, there were rumors that Blackwood was planning something nefarious, something that involved provoking the Lakota, possibly by defiling one of their sacred places. The name Bear Butte was mentioned. Blackwood means to use this totem to incite war, Nita said, her voice heavy with dread, or at the very least to drive the Lakota from the hills around Bear Butte so he can claim the land or whatever he believes is hidden there. He knows its significance. He will try to use its power for his own ends, twisting its meaning. Jedediah looked at the totem. The carved eagle seemed to stare back, its stone eyes challenging him. He was just a trapper, a man who wanted to be left alone. But he had accepted responsibility for Wakan and then for this totem. He couldn't stand by and let it be used to bring about more suffering, more bloodshed. "We have to warn them." Jedediah said the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We have to find Wakan's people, and we have to get this totem to them, or at least ensure it's safe." Nita nodded slowly. "It is a dangerous path, Jedediah, to venture into the heart of Lakota territory, especially now with these rumors poisoning the air. We could be seen as enemies by the very people we are trying to help. And Blackwood's men will undoubtedly be watching, waiting for us to make a move." "Is there any other choice?" he asked, his gaze steady. Nita met his look, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of his own reluctant resolve. "No," she said softly, "there is not. My mother's people are not warlike by nature, but they will defend what is sacred to them. And this totem, it is a piece of their soul. We must try." It was a desperate gambit born of necessity. They would be two small figures against a ruthless enemy and the vast, unforgiving wilderness, carrying an ancient piece of wood that had become both a sacred trust and a deadly liability. Their journey would be fraught with peril, every shadow a potential threat. every distant rider a possible enemy. But the decision was made. They would take the totem towards Bear Butte, into the heart of the storm. Blackwood was so eager to unleash. The decision to journey to Bear Butte hung heavy in the air of Nita's small cabin. It was a path fraught with dangers, both seen and unseen. Blackwood's men were undoubtedly watching and venturing deep into Lakota territory as unwelcome outsiders carrying a sacred object whose possession was already mired in rumor was a risk that could easily cost them their lives. They prepared meticulously, gathering what meager supplies they could carry: dried meat, hardtack, ammunition, and Nita's essential herbs for medicine. Jedediah cleaned his Winchester rifle and his Colt, his movements economical and precise. Nita packed a small bundle of trade goods, tobacco, a few beads, and a small mirror, hoping these might smooth their passage if they encountered Lakota patrols. The totem itself was carefully wrapped in layers of buckskin, then concealed within a larger bedroll. They left under the cloak of a moonless night, slipping away from Nita's cabin like ghosts, their horses' hooves muffled on the soft earth. Jedediah, with his years of experience navigating the wilderness, took the lead, choosing a circuitous route through dense forest and rugged draws, avoiding known trails and a-holes where Blackwood's men might lay an ambush. Nita rode behind him, silent and alert, her Spencer carbine resting across her lap. For days they traveled, pushing themselves and their horses to the limit. The landscape grew wilder, the granite peaks of the Black Hills looming larger, their pine-covered slopes whispering secrets in the wind. They spoke little, conserving their energy, their senses constantly pricked for any sign of pursuit. Jedediah found tracks twice, shod horses too many for a hunting party, heading in the general direction they were taking. Blackwood's men were indeed on their trail, relentless as wolves. The strain began to show. Jedediah, already lean, grew gaunter, his eyes shadowed with fatigue and vigilance. Nita, though equally tired, maintained a quiet strength that Jedediah found himself increasingly admiring. She knew the land in a different way than he did, recognizing edible plants, reading subtle signs in the behavior of animals, and understanding the spiritual pulse of the wilderness. Her presence was a steadying counterpoint to his own grim pragmatism. One evening, as they made a cold camp in a hidden ravine, Nita spoke of her own conflicted position. "My father, he tried to live in both worlds," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared into the small, smokeless fire they'd risked. "He thought he could bridge the gap, but in the end, he belonged to neither. The white traders cheated him, and some of my mother's people never fully trusted him." She looked at Jedediah. "Sometimes I feel that same division within myself. This journey, I do it for my mother's memory, for the respect I have for the Oyat. But I am also afraid, Jedediah, afraid of what we will find, and whether we will be accepted or seen as a threat." Jedediah understood her fear. He felt it himself, a cold knot in his own belly. "We're doing what we think is right, Nita. That's all any of us can do." Their first encounter with the Lakota came sooner than they expected. They were traversing a high meadow dotted with wildflowers when three riders appeared suddenly on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the morning sun. They were young warriors, armed with bows and rifles, their faces painted in stern lines. Tension crackled in the air. Jedediah and Nita reined in their horses, slowly raising their hands in a gesture of peace. The warriors approached, cautiously circling them, their expressions unreadable. One, who seemed to be the leader, addressed them in Lakota, his voice sharp and questioning. Nita responded in the same tongue, her voice calm and respectful. Jedediah couldn't understand the words, but he watched the warriors' faces, trying to gauge their reaction. There was suspicion definitely, but also a flicker of curiosity. Nita spoke for several minutes, gesturing towards the bundle containing the totem and mentioning the name Wakan. At the mention of Wakan, the lead warrior's expression shifted slightly. He spoke again, and Nita translated for Jedediah. He asks why we carry a sacred object of his people. He asks why we come to their lands when there are dark rumors about us. He is Tokala, the son of Wakan. Wakan's son. This was a complication and potentially an opportunity. Jedediah dismounted, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Tell him, he said to Nita, that his father was caught in a blizzard. I found him near death and took him to my cabin. I kept him warm and fed him until his strength returned. Weeks later, this totem was left at my door. I believe it was a gift from Wakan. Nita translated. Tokala listened, his dark eyes fixed on Jedediah, assessing, judging. He was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, with a proud bearing and an intensity that reminded Jedediah of a hawk. There was a deep mistrust in his gaze. He says his father told him of a white man who showed him kindness, Nita relayed, but he finds it hard to believe such a sacred totem would be given to an outsider. He thinks you might have stolen it, or that you intend to use it for some ill purpose. The rumors about you and Silas Blackwood have reached their camp. Blackwood is our enemy, not our friend, Jedediah stated firmly. He wants the totem for himself, to desecrate your sacred places, to stir up trouble between your people and mine. We came to warn you and to return this to Wakan or to ensure its safety. Nita translated again. There was a long silence. Tokala conferred with his companions in low tones. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the meadow. Finally, Tokala spoke. He says they will take us to their encampment. Nita said, a note of relief in her voice. But we will be watched. He is not yet convinced of our intentions. He says his father is wise, but sometimes too trusting of those outside the people. Under the wary escort of Tokala and his warriors, Jedediah and Nita continued their journey. It was a different kind of travel, now no longer furtive, but exposed, vulnerable. They were led deeper into the heart of Lakota territory towards the imposing silhouette of Bear Butte, which grew larger and more majestic with every passing mile. The Lakota encampment was a sprawling collection of teepees nestled in a wide grassy valley cradled by rolling hills, with the imposing spiritual presence of Bear Butte dominating the northern skyline. Smoke from countless cooking fires spiraled into the clear afternoon sky, and the air buzzed with the sounds of life, children laughing, dogs barking the rhythmic beat of a distant drum. Wakan emerged from the teepee, his steps slow but steady, his eyes, though aged, still sharp and perceptive. He looked older than Jedediah remembered, more frail, but his presence still commanded respect. When he saw Jedediah, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even warmth, crossed his weathered face. Then his gaze fell upon his son Tokala, and then to Nita, and finally to the carefully wrapped bundle Jedediah carried. Tokala spoke first, addressing his father in rapid Lakota, his tone conveying his suspicion and concern. Wakan listened patiently, his expression unreadable. Nita stood quietly, her demeanor respectful but firm. When Tokala had finished, Wakan turned his gaze to Jedediah. He spoke, his voice raspy with age, and Nita translated. He says he remembers the warmth of your fire, white man. He remembers the broth that brought life back to his frozen limbs. He asks why you have come to his people now, carrying such a burden. Jedediah stepped forward carefully, unwrapping the totem. As the intricately carved wood was revealed, a collective gasp went through the assembled Lakota. There were murmurs of awe, reverence, and for some, renewed suspicion. The totem was clearly an object of immense significance. Wakan, Jedediah began Nita translating his words. This was left at my door weeks after you departed. I believe it was from you. I have protected it. But a man named Silas Blackwood, a greedy and dangerous man from Redemption Gulch, he covets it. He believes it leads to treasure, or that he can use it to harm your people. His men attacked us. We came to warn you of his plans and to return this to you, its rightful owners, before it could be used for evil. Wakan's eyes studied the totem, then Jedediah's face. Takala interjected again, his voice sharp. Father, this Washiku could be lying. Blackwood may have sent them. How can we trust him with such a sacred object? It should never have left our people. An elder with a stern face, adorned with many eagle feathers, spoke up in agreement with Takala, his words echoing the sentiment of mistrust. The atmosphere grew tense. It felt as though the entire camp was holding its breath. Wakan raised a hand, and silence fell. He walked slowly towards the totem, his old hands reaching out to touch the carved eagle, then the wolf, then the bison. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if communing with the spirits of the wood. When he opened them, he looked not at Jedediah, but at his own people. He began to speak, his voice gaining strength, resonating with an ancient authority. Nita translated her own voice, filled with a dawning understanding and emotion. My people, Wakan said, listen to my words. This totem, the Wanian Waptuha, Wanagi the ancestor spirit, carving it is indeed sacred. It was carved many generations ago, not by our hand, but by the hand of a Washiku holy man, a man of peace who sought understanding with our ancestors when the first white settlers came to these lands long before the iron horse scarred the prairie. A murmur of disbelief went through the crowd. Takala looked stunned. Wakan continued, this totem was a pledge, a symbol of a forgotten peace, a promise between our great-grandfather, Chief Matto Luta Red Bear, and this settler whose name was Stone, Jonathan Stone. A promise that there could be understanding, respect, even friendship between our peoples. It was kept by his family for generations, a reminder of that fragile hope. It was lost to us when his descendants moved away or were killed in the conflicts that followed. The revelation was stunning. The totem was not just a Lakota artifact, but a shared legacy, a symbol of a peace that had been tragically lost. Jedediah felt a shiver run down his spine. His own surname Stone. Could it be mere coincidence? Or was there a deeper connection, a thread of destiny woven through generations? Wakan then addressed the immediate threat. The man Blackwood, he is known to us. He is a vulture who feeds on discord. The strange occurrences at Jedediah Stone's cabin, the feathers, the sounds, those were my young men, my eyes and ears, watching him protecting the totem, ensuring he was worthy of the trust I had placed in him, and to see if he would understand its deeper meaning, or if he, too, would be swayed by greed. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire erupted from the edge of the valley. Shouts of alarm rose from the camp. Blackwood, Takala yelled, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. He has found us. Silas Blackwood, impatient and arrogant, had not waited for Stone to lead him to a specific sacred site. Seeing the large encampment near Bear Butte, he'd decided this was his opportunity. He and his gang, Cully, the Rourke brothers, and a dozen other hard cases charged into the valley, rifles blazing, hoping to create chaos, snatch the totem in the confusion, and perhaps grab a few Lakota hostages for leverage. They were not aiming to conquer the entire camp, but to raid, pillage, and terrorize. Panic ensued. Lakota warriors grabbed their weapons, shouting war cries, moving to defend their families. Women and children scrambled for cover. Jedediah and Nita found themselves in the heart of the sudden battle. Wakan, despite his age, stood firm, directing his warriors. Tokala, his earlier suspicions of Jedediah momentarily forgotten in the face of the common enemy, rallied a group of young men. "They attack a peaceful camp," Wakan cried, his voice filled with righteous anger. "This Blackwood, he seeks to destroy all that is sacred." He looked at Jedediah. "The totem, it must not fall into his hands. It also marks a place, not of gold, but of our history. A cache of winter counts, sacred bundles, and records that prove our ancient claim to these hills hidden deep within Bear Butte, in the cave of whispering winds. That is what he truly seeks to plunder or destroy." Now, everything became terrifyingly clear. The totem was not just a symbol of peace, but a key to preserving the Lakota's heritage. Blackwood and his men were advancing using the scattered trees and rocks for cover, firing indiscriminately. Cully, the sharpshooter, took up a position on a small rise, his rifle cracking with deadly accuracy. Jedediah raised his Winchester. "Nita, stay with Wakan, keep him safe." He exchanged a look with Tokala. Words were unnecessary. They were from different worlds, with a history of conflict between their peoples. But in this moment, they had a common enemy, a shared purpose. Side by side, the solitary white trapper and the proud Lakota warrior prepared to defend the innocent and protect an ancient legacy from the rapacious greed of Silas Blackwood. The battle for Bear Butte and for the soul of the totem had begun. Jedediah Stone's tale is a testament to the courage found in unexpected places and the bridges that can be built even in the most divided of times. The ancient totem, a silent witness to a forgotten peace, reminds us that history's currents run deep, often connecting us in ways we least expect. What started with a simple act of kindness in a blizzard rippled outward, changing destinies and challenging old hatreds in the heart of the Wild West. If this story of bravery, unlikely alliances, and the enduring power of heritage resonated with you, please give this video a like. It truly helps our channel grow. Share it with others who appreciate tales of the untamed frontier and the complexities of the human spirit. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss out on our next journey into the dramatic heart of history. Thanks for listening, and until next time, may your own trails be filled with discovery.